In the middle of the worst storm Coldwater had seen in a decade, fire licked the treetops and sirens wailed in the distance. No one noticed the small, shaking shadow that darted between the flames. No one but one man, Benjamin Hart, a reclusive veteran who hadn't let anyone in since the day he buried his wife. But when he found a half-burnt box behind the old mill, and inside it, a kitten with a white crescent on her chest, he didn't walk away. He reached in, and something in his life shifted forever. What began as a rescue became a promise. What started with one broken animal soon drew in others: an old German shepherd who'd lost his partner, a blind senior dog, a puppy too scared to bark. And through fire, grief, and healing, they became a family. But no one knew this quiet story until the night the animals vanished, and one of them risked everything to bring the others home. The morning fog curled gently around the evergreens like memory refusing to let go. At the edge of Coldwater Bend, in a weathered cabin tucked between the trees and the creek, Benjamin Ward sat alone at the kitchen table, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that hadn't held coffee in 3 years. He didn't need caffeine anymore. The silence kept him awake better than anything else could. Across from him, Lucille's favorite teacup rested exactly where she'd left it on the windowsill, pale blue with a crack along the rim. He hadn't touched it, not once. The room held her like breath held in the chest, delicate, suspended, waiting for something that would never return. The books on the shelf still wore her bookmarks. Her shawl still hung on the back of the old rocking chair. Every so often, Benjamin swore he could smell her perfume lavender and something soft, like flower and pine. He didn't speak to people much anymore. Coldwater was the kind of town that respected silence, and he was grateful for that. After decades in military search and rescue, followed by Lucille's long illness, he didn't have the energy to explain the kind of grief that doesn't scream, but just sits with you, in the walls, in the bedsheets, in the air. The only sounds in the cabin now came from paws on wooden floorboards. Bruno, his eldest German shepherd, lay by the hearth with his muzzle graying and his body stiff. He was almost 12 now, half blind, but still noble in the way old soldiers carry themselves. Scout, leaner and sharper-eyed, perched near the front door, always alert. Hazel, the youngest of the trio at 9, padded softly behind Benjamin's chair, gentle as mist. They had all served beside him once. K9 partners in missions across rugged wilderness and disaster zones. When they retired, Benjamin brought them home. He always said he owed them more than medals and handshakes. Now, they were the only family he had left. Lucille had loved them too, called them her storm chasers, but she used to say the house needed balance. A cat, Ben, just a small one, for softness. He remembered the way her voice would turn wistful when she said it, especially near the end. Dogs protect, but cats remind you to rest. We should get one. One day. But one day had slipped away like breath on a winter pane. Benjamin rose from the table and walked toward the porch. Scout followed instinctively, nosing the air. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees, and Coldwater Creek murmured a warning in the distance, its current louder than usual for early fall. The porch steps creaked beneath his boots. Bruno stayed curled in his blanket, but Hazel came out and sat beside Scout, her ears twitching at every squirrel and gust of wind. The sky had begun to darken. Rain was coming. Benjamin gazed out over the bend in the creek, hands resting on the railing Lucille had painted sea green 3 summers ago. Most of the paint had flaked away now, but a patch near the middle still held its color. She'd carved a little heart into the wood there with the tip of a knife. He'd pretended not to notice. "Lucille," he murmured, almost without thinking. "I'm still here." Scout tilted his head, as if he'd heard something between the words. Back inside, Benjamin moved to the bedroom. The bed was made, but only one side showed wear. Her nightstand still had the book she'd been reading. Leaves of Grass, spine open like she might pick it up again. There, tucked beneath the lamp, was a note. Not a new one, just something he kept rereading, yellowed, curled at the corners. "Don't let the silence eat you. Let the house live again." Lucille Benjamin kept it in the pocket of his field jacket, folded neatly, next to an old military patch and a lighter that hadn't sparked in years. Downstairs, the dogs stirred. A low growl from Bruno. Scout let out one sharp bark. Rain began to spatter against the windows, slow and cold. Benjamin didn't know it yet, but this would be the last quiet day the house ever knew. The sky was already the color of bruised steel by the time Benjamin turned off the gravel road and rolled the pickup into the clearing. The wind had picked up, humming low through the branches like a warning too old to put into words. In the back seat, Hazel sat quietly, her amber eyes watching the clouds. Scout stood alert in the bed of the truck, nose lifted into the shifting wind. Bruno, slower to rise these days, had stayed home. His joints didn't do well in the cold anymore, and Benjamin hated seeing him limp. The supply run had been short just coffee, some canned stew, and more dog treats than any one man should buy. But it wasn't about what he brought home. It was about keeping the ritual alive. Lucille used to call it his excuse to stay human. He parked the truck beside the porch and stepped out, boots hitting the damp earth with a soft thud. The air smelled of pine, wet moss, and something heavier like the storm wasn't just weather, but memory pushing its way through the trees. He reached into his coat pocket and felt it again. The note. Lucille's handwriting, still creased along the same folds, still carrying the faint scent of her lotion. He didn't need to read it anymore. The words had already carved themselves into his mind. "Don't let the silence eat you. Let the house live again." He swallowed hard and tucked it deeper into the pocket. Some promises were small enough to ignore. Others refused to stay buried. "Come on," he said quietly, and Hazel jumped down as Scout trotted ahead. The three of them walked toward the edge of the property, where the wooden bridge spanned Coldwater Creek. Benjamin had built it himself in '92, sturdy, simple, and narrow enough that Lucille always insisted on holding his hand when they crossed. The creek below had swollen, the usual gentle babble replaced by a low roar. Rain had been coming steady all week, but tonight it was different. The wind smelled charged, as if something unseen had stirred the forest's bones. Scout stopped at the middle of the bridge, body rigid. Benjamin followed his gaze. Water churned beneath them, frothy and angry. Pieces of broken branch rushed downstream, bumping into the supports. He tightened his grip on the railing, slick and damp from mist. Hazel let out a soft whimper and pressed against his leg. "Easy, girl," he murmured, but his voice barely carried. He stood there for a long moment, the rain beginning to fall harder, soaking through his coat. The cold reached his shoulders and sank deeper, but he didn't move. Not yet. His hand drifted again to the note in his pocket. He'd promised her just before the cancer took her voice that he'd try to let the light in, try to keep the house from turning into a mausoleum, try to find that little gray cat she always wanted. "Not a fancy one," she had said with that weak, mischievous smile. "Just scrappy, like us." But she died 2 days later. Benjamin closed his eyes, and for a second, just a second, he thought he heard her voice riding the wind. Not words, just presence, like a memory stirred by the rain. Scout barked once, breaking the silence. Benjamin looked down. A branch had collided with one of the bridge posts, stuck there, water twisting around it like a warning finger. He exhaled and gave a slight nod. All right, let's go." The walk back was brisk. Hazel stuck close, while Scout trotted a few paces ahead, always looking back as if checking to make sure the ghosts hadn't followed. As Benjamin reached the porch, he paused. Rain poured heavier now, blurring the tree line, muting the sky. He looked back once more toward the bridge, toward the place where promises lingered, even when unspoken. He touched the pocket again. Tomorrow, he told himself. He would go to the shelter. He would look for a cat, not because he needed one, but because she had. The storm didn't wait for permission. By midnight, it had found its voice thunder cracking like gunfire across the hills, wind pushing sideways through the pines, the rain turning earth into mud and memory into weight. Benjamin sat on the edge of his bed, lacing his boots again. Scout had been restless all evening, pacing back and forth between the front door and the windows, ears twitching. Hazel was curled tight by the hearth, but her eyes stayed open, tracking every sound. Even Bruno, stiff-legged and weary, had lifted his head with a grunt when the first lightning strike lit the cabin's interior like a forgotten photograph. Then the barking started. Short, sharp. Not the kind meant to scare off intruders, but the kind that said something's wrong. Benjamin grabbed his raincoat without thought and was out the door in seconds, flashlight in hand. The beam jittered as he jogged across the yard, Scout already halfway down the path, looking back urgently, barking again. "Easy!" Benjamin shouted over the wind, but his boots were already sinking into the mud. They reached the bridge in less than a minute. The creek had risen nearly 2 feet since sunset. Water slammed against the supports, brown and furious, thrashing under the bridge like it had a vendetta. Scout stood at the middle of the span, nose over the edge, barking down into the dark. Benjamin approached, his breath sharp in his chest. He aimed the flashlight down. At first he saw nothing, just the chaos of floodwater, glinting rain, and broken limbs. But then something moved. Something small, clinging to a crooked tangle of reeds and twigs near the shore's edge. A tiny bundle of gray, soaked and trembling. Then another sound. Not the wind, not the creek. A whimper. Benjamin's stomach dropped. It was a kitten, barely more than a scrap of fur, pressed against the debris like a sailor to driftwood. One paw twitched, claws digging into a slick branch. Its head lifted, barely. And even through the downpour he saw it, those eyes wide with terror. And just above them, a faint crescent-shaped shimmer, white against the soaked gray fur, like moonlight had kissed her once and never left. "Damn it," he muttered. He turned to Scout. "Stay here." But the dog didn't budge. Hazel had appeared behind them now, panting and soaked already, her eyes locked on the water as if she understood everything without needing to be told. Benjamin moved fast. He retraced the bridge to the slope, boots slipping as he half ran, half slid down toward the creek bank. The flashlight in his hand bounced wildly, spotlighting roots, rocks, pieces of the world broken loose by the flood. He reached the edge. The kitten was still there, a few feet out, just beyond reach. Any closer and the bank would give way. Any wrong move and she'd be pulled under. He crouched low, eyes scanning the current. "Come on, little one," he murmured. "Hold on." Then Scout barked again. Benjamin turned in time to see him bounding down the far slope, Hazel following. They stopped at a point where the water was slower, shallower, a wedge of debris forming a natural dam. Benjamin's mind caught up. "Smart boy," he whispered. He crossed carefully, crawling across a half-submerged log. It bowed beneath his weight, creaking like an old memory. One misstep and he'd be in the water too, but he reached the other side. Now he was close. The kitten mewed, a weak, desperate sound. He stretched forward, belly against the earth, arm out. The rain pounded against his neck, his fingers numb. "Come on." The kitten lifted her head again, and then, impossibly, she moved. One paw, then another. She clawed forward inch by inch until Benjamin's fingers closed gently around her soaked frame. She was trembling, every rib visible. Her fur matted with mud, leaves clinging to her like the forest had tried to claim her. Benjamin held her to his chest. "You're safe now," he said softly. Scout barked once more, as if to say, "Took you long enough?" Benjamin stood slowly, cradling the tiny creature beneath his coat, and made his way back across the creek, the dogs trailing close. By the time they reached the cabin, thunder had softened into a grumble, like the sky had finally exhaled. Inside, the warmth hit hard. Hazel shook herself dry beside the door. Scout dropped onto the rug with a grunt. Bruno didn't rise, but his tail thumped once in greeting. Benjamin wrapped the kitten in an old towel. She shivered but didn't resist. He sat near the fire, holding her close. With every passing minute, the tremble in her tiny body faded. Her eyes stayed open, searching his face with a gaze that felt too knowing. He brushed her fur gently, clearing away the dirt. And there it was again. The crescent. Not a scar, not a stain, just a soft curve of white, like the imprint of a promise kept too late. Benjamin swallowed hard. Lucille would have loved her. "Looks like I found your cat," he whispered to the room, though he wasn't talking to the dogs. Outside, the storm moved on, leaving behind nothing but puddles and the echo of something that had waited far too long to be found. The rain had stopped sometime near dawn, but the clouds still hung low like a curtain of breath not yet exhaled. Benjamin moved quietly through the cabin, careful not to wake the others. Hazel snored softly near the hearth. Scout had positioned himself against the front door, ever the sentry, and Bruno, his head rested beside the empty rocking chair where Lucille used to sit with her tea, watching the birds wake up with the morning light. But the fire was out now, just a bed of smoldering red embers, glowing faintly in the ashes. Benjamin crouched beside it. In his arms, wrapped in the soft, time-worn folds of his old army blanket, the kitten stirred. He hadn't slept. Not really. Not since he pulled her out of the creek, skin like ice, body barely holding on. He'd dried her as best he could, warmed goat's milk on the stove, and fed her from a bottle he hadn't used in years, saved from back when Hazel had pups, and they couldn't all nurse at once. The kitten hadn't protested. Too weak to meow, but not too far gone to drink. Now she blinked up at him, damp fur fluffed into static. Her breathing had steadied. Her ribs didn't show quite so sharp. But what struck him most, what held his gaze, was the way she looked at him. Not just with the instinct of a creature clinging to survival, but something older, softer, as if in her tiny form Lucille had whispered, "I found my way back." Benjamin exhaled. He shifted to sit in Lucille's chair, the army blanket cradled like memory in his arms. The cushion sagged beneath him, still shaped by the weight of years shared and moments vanished too soon. He glanced down again at the kitten, this little survivor with storm-soaked fur and the crescent moon on her brow. The flickering firelight painted her coat in silvery shadows, the color of smoke rising from a campfire long after the flames had gone. Smoke and ash. He closed his eyes. Lucille's voice, clear as day, echoed in his mind. Some ashes burn quietly, but never die. She had said it one night years ago after a failed rescue mission. They'd lost 2 men to an avalanche in the Tetons. Benjamin had come home and sat wordless on the porch, snow still in his boots. Lucille had lit a fire and brewed tea the way she always did when he couldn't speak. And as the flames died down, she had stared at the coals and said, almost to herself, "There are some losses that never leave, some ashes. They just keep glowing." His chest tightened. He looked down at the kitten again, her eyes now closed, tiny breaths warm against his wrist. "Ash," he said aloud, the word settling like a feather on still air. Hazel lifted her head briefly, then rested it back down. Scout thumped his tail once. "Ash," Benjamin repeated, this time softer, with something almost like reverence. "Yeah, that's your name." It wasn't just the coat color. It wasn't just the fire or the memory of Lucille's words. It was what this little creature was. Something pulled from the wreckage, from a flood that tried to take her. Something lost, then found. Fragile. Quiet. But not dead. Ash. Benjamin rose gently, shifting the blanket to his shoulder like he had once done with Hazel's runt. He walked toward the kitchen, still holding the kitten close. He warmed more milk, watched the pot as if it were a sacred duty, poured a little into the tiny bottle, touched it to her lips. Ash suckled weakly, paws twitching. "You're gonna make it," he murmured. "I've seen worse, and I've seen survivors." She drank until her belly was round as a walnut, then curled into the blanket again. For a long time Benjamin just stood there, staring out the window into the fog-covered trees. The creek still roared in the distance, but inside the cabin there was peace. He turned to the mantel. Lucille's teacup was still there. He reached for it with a slow, steady hand, brushed off the faint layer of dust and set it beside the fireplace, closer to where the warmth could reach. Then, still holding Ash, he sat back in the rocking chair and whispered, "You'd have liked her, Lou." Outside, the first bird called. The storm had passed, but something new had arrived, wrapped in fur and silence, and the kind of presence that doesn't ask for permission to stay. The first full day with Ash dawned gray and cold, the kind of morning where the ground felt brittle underfoot and the sky couldn't make up its mind between drizzle or snow. Benjamin poured kibble into 3 stainless steel bowls, the sound echoing across the kitchen tiles like the rhythm of an old ritual. Bruno lumbered in first, the eldest of the trio, his joints stiff, his expression guarded. Scout followed, tail high, eyes bright, always watching for anything out of place. And Hazel, gentle Hazel, crept in last with careful steps, ears low and cautious. Ash was already there. Curled up atop the warm dryer in the corner, her tiny body tucked into the folds of a flannel shirt Benjamin had left there years ago. She didn't meow or move, only watched with steady, unreadable eyes. Scout noticed her first. He stopped in mid-stride and tilted his head, ears perked. A small whine escaped his throat, curious, not hostile. Bruno's growl came next, low, guttural, not loud, but heavy with warning. Hazel froze. Benjamin raised a hand. "Easy," he said gently, the word more for himself than for them. "She's not a threat." But the dogs didn't understand that, not yet. Ash sat up slowly, the soft crescent mark on her forehead glinting faintly in the muted light. Her body was still frail, bones barely padded by recovering muscle, but her posture, her presence, carried something older than size or strength. She didn't cower, didn't hiss, didn't run. She simply leapt from the dryer, landing silently, and walked past Bruno, her tail high, slow steps deliberate. She moved like smoke, unbothered by the tension thick in the room. Scout circled her, tail twitching. Hazel stepped backward. Benjamin held his breath. Bruno stared down at her, nostrils flaring. He'd led men through fire, found survivors buried beneath rubble, pulled Benjamin himself from a mountainside after a chopper crash in '97. He was loyalty carved into bone, but age had made him brittle, and change made him wary. Ash stopped inches from his paws. She looked up at him. Bruno growled again, louder, a warning from a soldier who'd earned every scar. Ash responded in the only way she knew how. She reached up, tiny paw outstretched, and pressed it gently against his chest, just once. Then she turned and walked away. Benjamin exhaled so hard it startled Hazel, who slipped behind the couch. Scout followed Ash, intrigued now. He sniffed her tail, then her side, then her ears. She let him. Didn't move, didn't flinch. The day passed in slow observation. Ash took to the windowsill, tracking birds with stillness only cats could master. Scout watched her like a student studying an unsolvable puzzle. Hazel kept her distance, always with one eye on the newcomer. Bruno stayed near Benjamin's chair, silent and unmoving. But he didn't growl again. By evening the sky bled into a soft orange. Benjamin built a new fire. Ash sniffed the hearth, then leapt up beside the kindling pile and lay there, chin on her paws, watching the flames like she understood how quickly warmth could vanish. He set up a soft basket of laundry near the heater, lined it with towels, placed the army blanket inside. "There," he whispered, stroking her back. "You'll sleep warm tonight." She blinked slowly at him, then stretched. Night settled in with a hush. Benjamin read a few pages of Lucille's favorite poetry book, the words barely clinging to his mind. Bruno snored softly beside his boots. Hazel lay tucked near the woodpile. Scout was sprawled belly up beneath the kitchen table. The house creaked in the wind, old bones shifting in their sleep. Benjamin turned off the last light. When he woke just before dawn, he checked the basket. Empty. His stomach clenched. He searched the room quietly, careful not to disturb the others. That's when he saw it, near the fireplace. Bruno's bed. In the oval of worn-out fleece, nestled against the heat of two large bodies, was Ash, tucked between Bruno's thick shoulder and Hazel's curled back. Scout lay just outside the bed, his tail twitching in rhythm with his dream. Ash was so small, she could have been missed completely, buried in their fur like a forgotten ember in a dying fire. But there she was, a sliver of silver in the dark. Lucille's words echoed again in Benjamin's chest. Some ashes burn quietly, but never die. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched, because something holy was unfolding in the silence, and even a soldier knows when to bow before it. The days in cold water grew colder, the light pulling away earlier each evening, as if the mountains themselves were folding their arms to brace for winter. In the silence of the woods, routines were everything. Benjamin rose just after dawn, a habit formed by years in the military and hardened further by decades in search and rescue. Even in retirement, his body obeyed the rhythm of discipline. Coffee at 0600, boots laced by 06 on 15, dogs out the door by 0630, no questions, no exceptions. Except now, there was Ash. She had, in her quiet way, begun to insert herself into the pattern, not with fanfare or mischief, but with the soft persistence of something meant to be there all along. It started with the morning walks. At first she merely watched as Benjamin clipped leashes onto Hazel and Scout. Bruno, old as he was, walked free, his pace steady, his loyalty unquestioned. Ash would perch by the door, ears flicking, eyes wide, tail curled neatly around her paws. Then one morning she walked out too. No leash, no command, just padded alongside Hazel with the kind of grace only cats carry. Benjamin paused at the top of the steps, mug in hand, uncertain whether to call her back or salute her courage. He said nothing, and she kept walking. Scout looked back once as if to say, "You seeing this?" Then trotted ahead, accepting her into the formation without ceremony. From that day forward, she never missed a walk. At first she stumbled through snowdrifts, tail high but legs uncertain. But within days she'd learned to follow in the grooves left by Bruno's paws, marching single file behind the dogs like she was born into a pack and simply late to the briefing. Benjamin would glance over his shoulder, watching this silent parade move through the trees. Bruno led, then Scout, then Hazel, and bringing up the rear, that ridiculous little gray shadow, head high, determined to keep pace. He chuckled under his breath. "Lucille," he murmured into the wind, "you sent me a cat who thinks she's a soldier." Ash followed them everywhere. When they circled the cabin after meals, she circled too. When they stopped to sniff at tree bark or broken tracks in the mud, Ash would pause with them, her nose twitching, whiskers flaring like antennae tuned to something older than instinct. She didn't bark, of course, but she understood the rhythm. When Benjamin whistled for them to return, she came running, two ears flattened from the cold, tail streaking behind her like smoke. By the end of the week, something stranger happened. She began waiting her turn. At mealtimes, Benjamin laid out the bowls like he always did, Bruno's first, then Scout's, then Hazel's. The dogs knew the order. It was an unspoken contract built on years of hierarchy and habit. Ash began sitting behind Hazel, not meowing, not weaving between legs, just sitting, waiting. Benjamin caught himself watching her, spoon halfway to the pan. "She's waiting for her bowl," he said aloud, though no one answered. And so he found an old ceramic dish, a cracked blue one Lucille used to use for fresh mint, and poured a little warmed goat milk into it, set it down. Ash didn't move until Hazel had taken her first bite. Then, only then, did she approach the bowl, tail low, body relaxed, as if it had always been this way, as if her spot had always existed, and she'd simply been away too long. That night, Benjamin sat by the fire, rubbing oil into Bruno's arthritic joints while Scout snoozed at his feet and Hazel curled up with her nose under a blanket. Ash sat beside the hearth, eyes fixed on the flicker of flame. Benjamin looked at her for a long time. "You're not just learning," he muttered. "You're remembering." She turned her head toward him, not startled, just aware. And in that second, something pulled tight in his chest, like grief, like awe, like Lucille whispering through the smoke, "Some ashes never die. They just wait for the wind to stir." He laughed, but it caught in his throat. "You really sent me a cat who thinks she's part of the unit." Ash blinked slowly, then stood, and without invitation, leapt onto the couch beside him. She pressed her body against his side, vibrating softly with a purr that seemed to echo the rhythm of his own breath. And for the first time in months, Benjamin didn't feel the cabin was empty. He looked at the fire, then at the quiet forms of his dogs, then down at Ash. A pack. No longer just habit. No longer routine. Something had shifted. Something had healed. The bell above the door gave a half-hearted jingle as Benjamin stepped into Coldwater's veterinary clinic, an old brick building that smelled faintly of pine cleaner, wet fur, and dusty linoleum floors that had seen decades of paw prints. Snow clung to his boots, melting into gray puddles at the welcome mat. Ash peeked out from the crook of his arm, bundled loosely in an old flannel. Her ears twitched. Her eyes scanned the waiting room with the precision of a soldier entering unfamiliar ground. Bruno lumbered in beside him, his gait slower than the others, but still proud. Scout padded ahead, alert as always. Hazel followed last, sticking close to Benjamin's leg, her eyes flitting nervously toward the front desk. Silence fell over the room. Mrs. Edith Blaine, wrapped in her usual wool coat and suspicion, sat stiff-backed near the window, with a trembling pug in her lap. Her lips pinched tighter as her gaze moved from the German shepherds to the cat in Benjamin's arms. Her voice sliced the silence like a blade against brittle china. "Well, I never," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A cat, with dogs, and not just any dogs, trained ones. It's unnatural." Benjamin gave her a cordial nod. "Morning, Edith." She did not return it. Instead, she leaned closer to the receptionist, a younger girl named Maeve, who had just returned from community college and still carried hope in her voice. "You mark my words," Edith whispered, not really whispering. "It starts with cats in coats, ends with the old man teaching it to drive a snowplow." Maeve bit the inside of her cheek and tried not to smile. Benjamin moved toward the counter, ignoring the glances behind him. "Just here for checkups," he said, gently placing Ash on the weighing scale. "One new recruit. 3 old war horses." Maeve blinked. "You brought them all?" They insisted. As if on cue, Scout sat promptly. Hazel leaned her head on the counter. "Bruno..." Well, Bruno found the only sunlit patch near the heater and laid down with a grunt that could have passed for a curse. Ash stayed still, her tail wrapped tight, eyes fixed on the floor tiles like they might rearrange themselves any minute. The waiting room buzzed with murmurs. "Is that the cat the ranger found in the storm? I heard it follows him like a dog. Real strange." "Didn't Lucille always want a cat? Maybe he's finally snapped, poor soul." Someone chuckled, then hushed themselves as Benjamin turned. But he didn't glare. He just stood, tall back straight, boots steady like the commander he used to be. The vet, Dr. Harland, emerged from the hallway with the kind of energy only retirement could take away. He was round in the middle, balding on top, and had a voice like warm syrup. "Ben," he said, shaking hands, "heard the whole town whispering before you even got out of your truck. You sure know how to stir up the place." "Didn't mean to," Benjamin said dryly, "just trying to keep up with the annual shots." Harlan chuckled. "Well, come on back. Let's get this little one checked first." He motioned toward Ash, who looked up as if she understood. Benjamin followed, cradling her with the same quiet reverence he once gave to field radios and folded flags. Scout trailed closely behind. The other 2 waited near the desk like sentries. In the exam room, Harlan checked her heart, ears, teeth. "Healthy, thin, but she'll fill out. You say she follows sit commands?" "She waits her turn to eat," Benjamin replied. "Joins the patrol, comes on whistle." Harlan raised a brow. "You train her?" "No. She watched." There was a pause. Harlan didn't speak immediately. He finished recording notes, then leaned back against the counter. "You know," he said, "Lucille used to tell me the quiet ones find their way to the broken things." Benjamin looked at him, a flicker of pain behind his eyes. She used to say a lot of things. Outside the exam room, someone sneezed. The pug let out a whimper, and over it all, Mrs. Blaine's voice returned sharp, sermon-like. God didn't make cats to heal. It's not natural. It's blasphemous, if you ask me. Benjamin sighed. Harlan grinned. Cold water's never been good with change. She's right, though, Benjamin said, running a thumb gently behind Ash's ear. It is unnatural. Ash looked up at him with that unreadable calm like snow that doesn't fall, just waits. But it doesn't mean it's wrong. They returned to the lobby just in time to see Scout firmly nose Hazel away from a bowl of free treats, only to drop one at her feet. Bruno was snoring softly near the heater. Ash wriggled out of Benjamin's arms and padded toward the dogs. Mrs. Blaine's eyes followed her like she might sprout horns, and in front of everyone, without invitation, Ash slipped between Bruno's paws, curled up beside Hazel, and rested her head on Scout's tail. The waiting room froze. Benjamin looked at the murmuring crowd and gave a quiet shrug. She's part of the team, he said simply. And the dogs didn't object. The morning broke slow and gray, the kind of overcast that dimmed the world to muted hues and made even the trees seem to whisper in softer tones. The pines that bordered Coldwater stood still in reverence, their needles heavy with dew and memory. Benjamin Ward pulled the truck off the gravel path and stepped out, boots crunching the frosted leaves. He didn't bring flowers. Lucille never liked store-bought bouquets, said they always died too quickly. Instead, he brought company. Bruno ambled out first, joint stiff but spirit steady. Scout followed with purpose, ears high, eyes scanning. Hazel stayed close to Benjamin's side. And nestled in the crook of his elbow, swaddled in an old knit scarf that still carried the scent of cedar and lavender, was Ash. The small cemetery sat on a quiet hill overlooking the Pine Valley, a place Lucille had chosen herself. "I want to sleep where the pines hum lullabies," she once told him, curled in the porch swing with her tea. He'd laughed back then, thinking it was one of her whims. Now, it was all he had left to visit. They walked in silence, save for the soft padding of paws and the occasional creak of Bruno's joints. The headstone came into view, simple and weathered, with Lucille's name carved beneath a pair of pressed lavender stems, and the words, "Loved beyond life, gentle through every storm." Benjamin knelt beside it, resting one hand on the cold stone, the other still wrapped around Ash. "Morning, Lou," he murmured. Brought the crew. The dogs settled around him, instinctively forming a protective half-circle. Scout sat straight, ever the sentinel. Bruno flopped with a heavy sigh, and Hazel curled into herself, tail tucked neatly. Benjamin unfolded the scarf and gently set Ash down. The kitten blinked once at the grass, then turned toward the headstone. She padded forward with delicate steps, nose twitching as if she could smell the woman beneath the earth. "She's not a replacement," Benjamin said softly. "I know you wanted a cat. I never got around to it. Always said I would after retirement. You said the house needed something small, something soft to balance out all the barking and brass." He chuckled quietly. It was a dry sound, almost brittle. "I thought I missed my chance. But then this little one shows up, on the worst night, in the pouring rain, under a damn bridge." His voice trembled at the edges. He cleared it. "She's not what I expected, not what anyone expected, but she's different. Brave in ways I've never seen, obedient when she doesn't have to be, curious, but kind. The others," he looked over, Bruno had his chin resting on his paws, eyes closed. Hazel was gently licking Ash's head, and Scout, ever ceremonious, had disappeared for a moment, only to return with a pine cone in his mouth. He placed it beside the grave, then stepped back. Benjamin smiled, blinking away a sudden sting in his eyes. Scouts always had that sense of ritual. Never forgot your birthday, remember that? He sighed. Anyway, folks in town are talking, saying I've gone strange, saying a cat doesn't belong with dogs, that I'm training her like she's one of them. Maybe I am. Maybe she is. Ash, perhaps responding to his voice, curled up right on top of Lucille's grave, tucked her paws beneath her tail wrapped neat, and stayed. Benjamin watched her settle in and whispered, "She's not yours, Lou, but she's a miracle, a quiet one, the kind you would have noticed when no one else did." The wind stirred the trees gently above them, sending a soft cascade of pine needles down like an old lullaby, just as Lucille had imagined. He stayed there a while longer, fingers brushing the headstone, letting the stillness hold them all. And when he rose, brushing dirt from his knees, Ash rose with him. She didn't meow. She didn't need to. She just followed right between the three shepherds, as if she'd always belonged in the middle of the pack. As they walked back through the pines, Benjamin murmured over his shoulder to the stone behind him, "She's home now." And this time he believed it. The days grew shorter in Coldwater, and the air now carried the scent of wood smoke and pine sap, a quiet promise of winter to come. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of the house had changed, softened, widened, warmed. There was a fifth heartbeat now. Ash no longer clung timidly to the corners or curled beneath the furniture like a visitor waiting for permission. She walked with purpose, light and small, yes, but with the confidence of one who had earned her place. And the dogs, once wary, now moved around her like they had known her forever. Hazel was the first to give in. It started on a cold morning when the wind howled through the gaps in the window panes. Benjamin had laid out an old quilt in the corner of the living room. Hazel's favorite, a faded blue thing that still smelled faintly of lavender and the lemony detergent Lucille once used. Hazel curled into it as always, nose tucked beneath her tail. But Ash didn't hesitate that day. She climbed onto the blanket, paused for a heartbeat, and then carefully, respectfully, settled beside Hazel. Not touching, but close enough to feel her warmth. Hazel lifted her head, eyes soft. No growl, no warning, just a blink. Then she shifted, slightly, just enough to make room. Benjamin, watching from the armchair with his coffee cradled in both hands, smiled. Later that afternoon he found Bruno standing sentinel by the front window. The old shepherd's ears twitched at every creak in the wood or rustle beyond the porch. Years of service had carved habit deep into his bones. Ash sat beside him, her tail wrapped neatly, copying his posture. She looked ridiculous next to the massive dog, like a shadow, pretending to be substance, but Bruno didn't seem to mind. And then it happened. A squirrel skittered across the railing, its nails tapping on the wood. Bruno barked a deep, commanding alert that once froze entire squads during missions. Ash jumped to her feet. Her mouth opened. Out came a sound. Not a bark. Not really. More like a gravelly "murrah" that ended on a wheeze. Bruno turned to her, huffed once through his nose and wagged his tail. Approval. Benjamin chuckled from the kitchen doorway. "Well, I'll be. You're learning from the best, kid." That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge and cast the cabin in golden shadows, Scout took her turn. The ever-alert middle child of the pack had been the last to fully warm to Ash, not out of suspicion, but out of duty. She had always been Lucille's favorite, and Benjamin knew Scout guarded things not just with teeth, but with heart. But even she, it seemed, had made peace. Benjamin watched as Scout led Ash around the backyard just before dinner, slow, deliberate loops near the tree line, stopping to sniff the ground, then looking back as if saying, "Now you try." Ash mimicked her movements, tail flicking side to side, paws quiet against the pine needles. It wasn't training, it was bonding. That night, as the storm clouds gathered again, they all huddled by the fire. Hazel had let Ash curl into the crook of her belly. Bruno lay on the rug like a mountain. Scout rested with one eye open, and Tiny Ash let out a soft mewl and stretched her paws against Hazel's side. No one flinched. Outside the wind picked up. Inside it was steady. Whole. The next morning it came. A knock. Not a loud one, just the brief thud of a box being dropped on the porch. Benjamin peeked through the curtain. A delivery man was already halfway down the drive, his coat flapping in the wind. He opened the door and stepped out, and behind him a sound. He turned. Ash stood at the threshold. Tiny frame, tall. Hackles puffed. That same awkward, raspy, half-bark meow she'd been working on. Benjamin blinked, then burst into a laugh. "Is that your warning cry?" Ash looked up at him, eyes wide, as if unsure whether she had done something brave or foolish. Bruno came up behind her and let out a single authoritative woof. Scout followed with a soft growl. Hazel padded quietly to Ash's side. Benjamin reached down, scooped Ash into his arms, and said it with warmth wrapped in a smile. "You're one of them now." She purred deep and steady against the worn flannel of his shirt. As he brought her back inside, dogs filing in behind like sentinels escorting royalty, Benjamin glanced at the corner where Lucille's photo still sat framed on the shelf, her smile timeless, knowing. Somewhere in that silent space he swore he heard her whisper, "Told you we needed something soft." It started with something simple. A kettle left on the burner after Benjamin warmed broth for Hazel's stiff joints. The stove's old coil glowed faint red under the dim light, forgotten in the rhythm of routine. Outside, the world slept beneath a cold quilt of mist and moonlight. Inside, everything was still. The fire didn't start with a roar. It started with a whisper. Ash stirred first. She had always been a restless sleeper, never curled in one place for long. Tonight, she had nestled against Scout's flank in the corner dog bed, but her ears twitched, her nose quivered, something shifted. She rose, quietly, like a shadow folding into itself. Smoke has no footsteps, no heartbeat. But Ash felt it, an unease in the air, something unnatural sliding through the wood grain of the floorboards. She padded across the room, nose to the air, tail low, fur bristling. In the kitchen, the scent found her, sharp, acrid, thin at first. Not the warm aroma of stew or the comforting musk of old ash from the hearth. No, this was wrong. Wrong like mold on bread. Wrong like something burning that wasn't meant to. She crept closer. A tendril of smoke curled up from the back burner, where a kitchen towel, threadbare, blue-checkered, once Lucille's, had slipped off the counter's edge. One corner brushed the red-hot coil. Ash backed away, eyes wide. She turned, bolted to the living room. The dogs still slept, heavy, dreamless sleep, the kind only age or peace can bring. She chirped first, a stuttered sound, then a growl odd coming from her throat, but urgent. Her claws tapped on the floor. She pawed at Bruno's side, then ran to Benjamin's door and clawed again. Nothing. She climbed the stairs. Benjamin lay on his back, one arm across his eyes, the other dangling over the edge of the bed like he was waiting for someone to take it. The room smelled of cedar and old grief. Ash leapt onto the bed. She meowed, insistent, stepped onto his chest, her tiny paws pressed into him with no gentleness. She gave a sound she had never made before, a sharp, broken yowl that split the stillness like a bell. Benjamin's eyes flew open. He sat up too fast, and the room spun. "Ash?" The smoke hit him a second later, thick, real. Then came the sound pops and cracks from downstairs, wood complaining, heat rising. He was out of bed in a heartbeat. "Ash, where?" But she was already gone, sprinting down the hall, her small shadow a signal. Benjamin grabbed the flashlight, flung open the bedroom door. Smoke licked the ceiling, curling in ghostly spirals down the staircase. The alarm hadn't gone off damn battery again. He ran. Ash had made it to the living room. She leapt into Hazel's bed, yowling and pawing at them. Scout stirred first, then Bruno. The crackle grew louder. From the kitchen, flames had started to bloom, angry orange light spilling across the floor like it was claiming territory. Benjamin hit the switch by the door. Dead. Power out. "Everyone out!" he shouted, voice hoarse already from smoke. Bruno was up. Hazel staggered, confused, until Benjamin lifted her front legs. "Come on, girl. We've done worse in worse weather." Scout barked. A real bark this time. Ash stood near the doorway, waiting. Benjamin herded the pack through the mudroom and shoved open the back door. Cold air rushed in like a slap. Behind them, the fire snapped louder. Out they went, Bruno first, Hazel leaning on Benjamin, Scout darting ahead. But Ash wasn't behind them. He turned. She was at the threshold, staring up the staircase. Her tail lashed once. She darted back inside. "Ash, no!" Benjamin didn't think. He ducked back in. Heat blistered the walls now. The towel had caught completely, flames licking the cabinets. Black smoke crawled like hands across the ceiling. Ash reappeared, dragging something, a photo frame, Lucille's. Benjamin froze. Ash dropped it, then sprinted back toward him. He scooped her up, coughing hard. One arm shielded her, the other pushed the door open again. They tumbled into the frost-covered grass just as glass exploded behind them. Hazel whined. Scout stood sentinel. Bruno paced in circles like a soldier looking for orders. Benjamin collapsed to his knees. Ash was in his arms, breathing fast but steady. Her white crescent mark glowed faintly under the moonlight, speckled with soot. He looked at the photo still clutched in her tiny teeth, cracked but whole. Lucille's face, frozen in the past, smiled out at them. Benjamin's voice cracked through the silence. "You saved us," Ash purred, and in that sound, in the smallest, most fragile vibration, was something ancient, something feral and kind. The kind of instinct that doesn't come from training, but from something older, something called home. The night hung still, the kind of stillness that settles over grief-stricken places, quiet, not from peace, but from exhaustion. Outside, frost had crept across the windows like veins, and the forest held its breath beneath a veil of mist. Inside the cabin, only the faint tick of the old mantel clock could be heard, until it wasn't alone. Ash stirred. At first, it was subtle, a twitch in her ear, a narrowing of the eyes. Something about the air changed. Not cold, not sound, just wrong. She lifted her head from Scout's flank and sniffed. The scent was faint, but insistent, acrid and sharp, laced with heat. Not the familiar musk of burnt toast or drying wood. This was different. She rose from the dog bed. Ash padded toward the hallway where Benjamin's door was closed, her steps soundless on the wooden floor. Smoke, light as breath, began slipping through the slats of the door. She sniffed again. The edge of panic nipped at her chest. She pawed at the base of the door. Nothing stirred. She mewled once, then louder. Still silence. Inside the bedroom, Benjamin lay tangled in sleep deep and drugged by grief, his body too tired to hear warnings. Ash scratched harder, then turned her eyes toward the doorknob. Lucille's old robe hung there, threadbare flannel, faded blue with yellow flowers. The scent of her still lingered in its folds, a ghost of lavender and hand soap. Ash remembered curling against that robe when Benjamin left it on the chair once. She remembered Lucille's voice, warm and cracked like firewood. Some ashes burn quietly, but never die. Ash leapt. Her paws hooked the bottom of the robe. She tugged once, twice. It didn't fall. She climbed it instead, clawed her way halfway up, biting at the hem. It gave, and the robe swung just enough for it to hit the edge of the door. A muffled knock echoed through the room. Benjamin stirred. A cough slipped from him, his first reaction to the smoke. Ash dropped to the ground, yowled again, and darted toward the door. As the knob turned, the door cracked open. "Lucille?" Benjamin rasped, confused. The scent now unmistakable. Smoke poured in like spilled ink. "No." Ash darted between his legs, down the hall. She stopped halfway, turned back. Her eyes locked with his, wild, shining. That snapped him awake. The kitchen. The air had changed, thick and pulsing with heat. From the hallway he could see it flames licking the cabinets, the stove glowing like the eye of something ancient and hungry. "Ash!" he barked, already moving. But she was ahead of him. Scout and Bruno stirred from the commotion. Hazel gave a grumbled protest as she sat up slowly. Benjamin grabbed the emergency extinguisher from the pantry, eyes already stinging, lungs resisting. He sprayed hard-aimed at the core of the fire. Foam hissed, smoke hissed louder. It didn't stop the fire entirely, but it slowed it. Ash stood back, near the living room, not retreating, watching. The fire smoldered as Benjamin threw a blanket over what was left of the burner. He stomped at embers, coughing hard. When the flames finally surrendered, only the scorched outline of the stove remained, black smoke rising like breath from the mouth of a sleeping giant. Silence returned, broken only by Benjamin's ragged breathing. Ash crept forward. Benjamin dropped to his knees. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her. At her tiny chest rising and falling so quickly, at the flecks of soot in her fur, at the glimmer of something in her eyes that didn't belong in a creature so small. Fear, yes, but more than that, duty. "I didn't hear it," he whispered, ashamed. "I didn't smell it. Didn't feel it." Ash inched closer. Benjamin reached out, and Ash did something she'd never done before. She crawled into his lap, pressed her head into the crook of his elbow. Her body shook once, like a leaf letting go. "You called me," he murmured, burying his face in her smoky fur. "You knew before the rest of us." Scout came and sat beside them. Bruno leaned his massive weight into Benjamin's shoulder. Hazel settled down at their feet with a soft groan. The pack had gathered, not around a fire, but around a cat. Benjamin let out a long breath. He stroked Ash gently, fingers trembling. "You're not just a miracle," he said hoarsely. "You're my warning bell." Ash's eyes fluttered shut. And somewhere in the shadowed corners of the room, still smoky from what could have been a tragedy, something shifted. She wasn't just part of the pack anymore. She was its heart. The air was growing heavier by the second. Even after Benjamin had managed to smother the worst of the flames, smoke was still thick in his lungs, curling into the hallways, leaving behind streaks of ash along the ceiling. He stood there, coughing, arms shielding his face, disoriented, the world around him coated in gray. A hiss sounded from the wall socket near the sink, then a spark, then another. His eyes widened. "Electrical's gone," he rasped. "It's not over." A low rumble echoed through the beam's wood, groaning from within. Scout barked once sharp and clipped. "Go!" Benjamin ordered, voice cracking. The dogs didn't need to be told twice. Bruno ran first, charging through the back door. Hazel limped close behind, her old hips trembling, but her eyes alert. Scout kept circling, barking toward the hallway until Ash finally emerged from the smoke, her small body almost invisible in the haze. Benjamin scooped her up without thinking. She didn't squirm. Together they fled. The night air hit like a slap cold and cleansing. Smoke bled out from the door behind them. A moment later there was a low pop from inside the cabin. Benjamin turned just in time to see a section of the kitchen ceiling collapse inwards. Flames licked upward again, uncontrolled now. He didn't try to go back, didn't even hesitate. He dropped to his knees on the frozen earth, coughing so hard it brought tears to his eyes. The dogs circled him, confused, anxious. Ash jumped down from his arms and sat beside him, calm. Too calm. Her fur was rimmed in soot. Her paws darkened. She blinked slowly, gaze fixed on the cabin that had once been her shelter. Benjamin pressed his palm against the frozen dirt and stared at the place he had nearly died in. Because of a mistake. Because he had left the stove on. Because grief had made him careless. And a cat, a little gray shadow with no voice, had saved him. Saved all of them. He looked down at her. Ash met his eyes. She didn't ask for recognition, didn't puff her chest or purr for comfort. She just sat there, breathing steady, as if she understood something about endings and beginnings far more than her small body should have allowed. Benjamin's throat tightened. His voice broke as he whispered, "Lucille." He swallowed hard. Smoke still lingered in his sinuses, but it wasn't the smoke that stung his eyes. "You really did send her, didn't you?" He reached forward with a shaking hand and gently ran his fingers along Ash's back. She didn't flinch. Her fur was still warm despite the chill, a quiet reminder of the fire she had walked through for them. "She's not like the others," he murmured. "She's not just smart. She knows. She listens." He looked up at the sky. Stars blinked faintly through the smoke trail overhead. And for a moment the stillness returned, but it wasn't the same stillness as before. This was the hush that comes after something breaks, the quiet that follows survival. Hazel limped over and placed her chin on Ash's back. Bruno circled them once and settled behind, tail thudding gently. Scout, ever the sentinel, stood a few feet off, watching the cabin until it finally stopped crackling. Benjamin pulled them all in closer, his arms around fur and muscle and soot and silence. "My girl," he whispered, voice barely holding. "You saved us." Ash blinked once, slowly, and tucked herself into the crook of his leg. No meow, no fanfare, just presence. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the pine trees at the edge of the clearing. Embers floated from the collapsed roof, glowing faintly as they danced into the night. One of them landed near Benjamin's boot and faded into the frost. Ash watched it and didn't move, because this was not the end. This was only the proving ground. And in the center of that circle, survivors wrapped in soot and breath and trembling hearts, sat the smallest among them, the silent hero. The rain had returned, not in whispers this time, but in war drums. Sheets of water slammed against the tin roof of the shed where Benjamin and the animals had taken temporary shelter. The old radio scavenged and stubborn buzzed through static on the makeshift shelf near the window. Flash flood advisory now upgraded, Coldwater Creek cresting past safe levels. All residents advised to evacuate immediately. The voice crackled, then faded into a warning tone that rose and fell like a distant cry for help. Benjamin didn't move. He stood near the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, the other clutching the collar of his coat, as if it might shield him from more than just the weather. Outside, Coldwater wasn't a town anymore. It was a bruise swelling under the pressure of the storm. The creek that once whispered behind the hills now roared like something ancient and unkind. He could hear it from here. How close it had gotten. Too close. Hazel whimpered low, pacing near the straw bedding. Bruno pressed his weight against the door, ears taut. Scout stood guard again, eyes fixed on the road, body humming with unease. And Ash. Ash sat on the windowsill, her gray fur damp, her forehead marked still with that faint white crescent. She didn't blink. The emergency siren blared again, this time from the valley station. 3 long howls into the wind. Evacuate! Benjamin's jaw locked. He turned toward the storage trunk near the back of the shed, pulled out a folded waterproof tarp, checked the emergency rations, did a quick head count. 4 animals, 1 old man, no car, and no intention of leaving one behind. He knelt beside the dogs and ran a hand down Hazel's trembling side. "We're not going anywhere without each other," he said softly. "You hear me?" Scout responded with a nudge. Bruno let out a soft chuff. Ash padded over and curled into the crook of Benjamin's knee, watching him, not pleading, not afraid, just waiting. Benjamin exhaled shakily. "Lucille used to say storms don't ask permission," he muttered, "but they do tell you what matters." He looked down at Ash. "I already lost 1 home. I'm not losing this one, not you." He pulled out the emergency leash set and a battered raincoat for Hazel, wrapped Ash gently in a scarf before tucking her into the padded satchel he'd kept for emergencies. Her head peeked out, whiskers twitching at the smell of ozone. Thunder cracked again, closer this time, and the creek answered. The water was rising. Benjamin stepped outside just enough to see the slope leading into town. What had once been a dry road was now a churning stream. They had minutes, maybe. He turned back into the shed, eyes scanning his small pack scout. Bruno, Hazel, and Ash lined up, waiting for his lead. "I hope heaven's got room for one more foolish old man," he whispered. Then he whistled once sharp and low, and the pack moved, together. The evacuation shelter used to be a community gym bleachers, now folded into walls, basketball lines blurred beneath muddy footprints, and the shuffle of wet boots. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, too bright and too cold. The scent was a mix of damp wool, disinfectant, and silent exhaustion. Benjamin stood in line, rain still dripping from the brim of his weathered hat. His coat clung to him like a second skin, heavy with creek water. Behind him, Bruno gave a low growl, not out of aggression, just warning. Scout kept his eyes moving. Hazel leaned into Benjamin's leg, needing his nearness more than ever. Ash stirred in the padded satchel slung across his chest. Her small gray face peeked out, eyes wide and alert, ears twitching at the sharp, mechanical sounds around them. A volunteer stepped forward, a young man in a neon vest and clipboard in hand. "Sir, are these your animals?" "They're family," Benjamin replied evenly, not bothering to disguise the edge in his voice. The young man offered a stiff smile. "We'll get them situated. We've got kennels and food in Section B for dogs, but—" He paused, scanning the list. "Cats have to be housed separately. Policy." Benjamin's hand moved protectively over Ash's back. "She's not just a cat. She's with them." "Sir, I understand, but shelter rules are clear. Cross-species containment's not allowed. Stress reactions, safety protocols. We've had problems before." Benjamin's jaw tightened. He glanced down at his pack Bruno, already tensing, Hazel's tail stiff, Scout looking up at Ash like she might vanish. "You don't understand," Benjamin said, low. "They sleep in the same bed. They eat together. That little one warned us of the fire. She's why we're here." The volunteer hesitated. "I'm sorry, sir, but it's non-negotiable. She'll be safe. It's just temporary." Ash gave a tiny, almost inaudible mewl as if she knew. Her claws dug into the satchel's lining. Benjamin didn't argue further. He'd spent too many years fighting things that didn't bend. Some storms you walked through, others you endured. They led the dogs first, Scout straining at the leash as if refusing to leave without her. Bruno dug his paws in, growling low until Benjamin's voice coaxed him forward. Hazel hesitated at the door, glancing between Benjamin and the woman in scrubs calling for her. "It's okay," Benjamin whispered. "Go on, girl. I'll be right behind you." Then came Ash. They took her down a narrow hallway toward a room in the back of the building, sterile, fluorescent, and quiet in all the wrong ways. A series of cages lined the walls, and though they gave her a larger one with a fleece blanket, the space felt wrong. As the door clicked shut behind her, Ash turned toward Benjamin, pressing her face against the mesh. He crouched beside the enclosure, one hand resting against the cold wire. "I know," he murmured. "It's not home, not the pack. But I'll fix it. You just stay strong, little soldier." Her eyes didn't blink. She didn't cry. She just waited. The rain hadn't let up. Outside the emergency shelter, the world was mud and moonlight. The sky hung low, heavy with the weight of a swollen creek and the hush of people holding their breath. Inside, most were asleep, cocooned in cots, wool blankets pulled tight, dreams numbed by exhaustion. But not Bruno. He lay stiff in the crate they'd assigned him, eyes open and ears alert. The absence of Ash clawed at something instinctual in him, something older than commands or conditioning. The scent of her wasn't here, and that, to Bruno, was wrong. At 2:08 a.m., he stood. No bark, no whine. Just a slow turn toward the latch. Metal, soft, biteable. He began to chew. Years of discipline hadn't dulled his jaw strength. Wire bent with each grind of his teeth. When the lock gave a soft click and popped free, he pushed through, barely making a sound. Hazel stirred from a corner crate. Scout sat up, ears pricked, but said nothing. In their world, this was understood. Bruno sniffed the air, rain, bleach, wet socks. but beneath it all, faint. There it was. Ash. Like memory wrapped in fog, her scent called to him through the night. He slipped past the sleeping volunteers. Through the service door someone forgot to latch. The outside air hit him like a drumbeat, wet and thick. He didn't flinch. He ran. Mud splashed up to his chest as he crossed the parking lot, then the fence line, down past the flood channel, under the creaking bridge. His paws churned over the soaked ground, following every trace she left behind. His coat grew heavy, but he pressed on. 1/2 mile. 1 mile. 2. By mile 3 his legs ached, but the scent grew stronger. Ash was close. He found the side door of the vet annex, what had once been the storage wing, now turned into temporary animal holding. A side window had been left cracked open for ventilation. Not enough for a man, but a determined dog? Enough. Bruno leapt, clambered up a stack of overturned crates, shoved his shoulder through the opening, and dropped inside with a thud that startled a cage of guinea pigs into silence. There she was, caged, alone, awake. Ash didn't hiss, didn't cry. She simply stood and pressed her tiny face to the bars as Bruno approached. The rumble in his chest wasn't a growl. It was relief. It was home. He nudged the latch with his snout. Not locked, just clicked shut. He pawed it. Nothing. Bit down gently, wiggle, tug, and then open. Ash padded out, tiny, fragile, unafraid. Bruno lay down beside her on the cold floor, wrapping his large body around hers. Ash nestled into his chest fur as if she had been waiting for this moment all night. They stayed like that, in silence. Nothing else moved, nothing else needed to. What they didn't know, what Benjamin wouldn't see until the next morning, was that a security camera in the top corner had captured every second of it, the escape, the journey, the reunion. By dawn, the video was already being shared by shelter volunteers. By 8 a.m., it had a caption. Dog risks everything to reunite with cat. Loyalty has no species. By noon, it had gone viral. But in that quiet vet room, where a damp dog guarded a soot-colored kitten with the stillness of a soldier standing watch, there was no need for cameras or headlines. There was only one truth. The pack was whole again. Edith Blaine didn't cry often, not at weddings, not when the oak tree in her front yard came down in a storm, not even when her husband passed, leaving only his garden boots and the radio still tuned to baseball. But this video. It looped silently on her tablet, the screen no bigger than a hardback book, propped against a chipped sugar jar on the kitchen table. She watched Bruno nudge open the crate, watched the cat crawl into the crook of his chest. No meowing, no barking, just stillness, trust. Edith swallowed hard, glasses fogged from her own breath. She'd called it unnatural. She'd whispered at the post office, "That old man's losing it." But this? This wasn't madness. This was something the world had forgotten how to name. By noon, she'd pulled out her old sewing machine. It was loud, temperamental, made a thud like a heartbeat each time the needle stabbed down. She dug through a cedar chest for the soft fleece she'd bought 3 winters ago and never used. Pale gray, almost ash-colored. By evening, she stood on Benjamin's porch with the folded blanket in her hands. The house behind her still smelled faintly of smoke, but the repairs had begun. She knocked. The door creaked open, and Benjamin appeared, tired, flannel-clad, with Scout wagging behind him. She started, then stopped. Edith Blaine had never been good at apologies, but she held out the blanket. "For her," she said. "I embroidered it." Benjamin blinked. "You embroidered Ash?" Edith sniffed. "Couldn't sleep until I did. And I figured if a cat can act like a dog and save a man's life, then a woman like me can at least sew her name proper." Ash padded over from behind the couch, slow and curious. Edith knelt, bones cracking as she did, and laid the blanket on the floor. It was small, neatly hemmed, and stitched in blue thread at one corner. Ash, little soldier. Ash stepped onto it like it was woven from memory, not fleece. She circled once, then twice, and curled into it with the softest, nearly inaudible purr. Edith reached out, fingertips trembling. She didn't pet, just hovered her hand above that small, soot-colored back. "I misjudged you," she whispered. "Little soldier." Benjamin stood quietly in the doorway, watching the moment bloom. Somewhere outside, cold water exhaled. The flood waters had receded. The town had power again. But the real change, the quiet kind, had happened right there on his floor, not in the news feed, not on the viral post, but in the soft tremble of an old woman's voice, and the purr of a cat who once had no name. It started with a knock, then two, then a dozen pairs of boots trailing wet footprints across Benjamin's front porch. People came with more than casseroles and canned beans. They brought hammers, post-hole diggers, and buckets of mismatched paint. Kids with cheeks pink from wind held up drawings on notebook paper, crayon depictions of a little gray cat wearing a sheriff's badge flanked by 3 lopsided dogs. "Is this Ash?" one girl asked, holding up a picture that made Ash look more like a raccoon with a tail on fire. Benjamin laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. "That's her all right," he said, patting the child's shoulder. Scout barked once, wagging at the crowd. Hazel stayed close to the steps, watching everyone with wary but soft eyes. Bruno stood by the half-burned gate, like a sentry. The new fence went up in a weekend. 3 neighbors from the other side of the creek did most of the digging. One of them, a former high school shop teacher, insisted on reinforcing it with recycled storm paneling. "Nothing's blowing this thing down," he declared, hands on his hips. Behind the house, they cleared space beside the old root cellar. By Tuesday, the church committee had arranged for a prefabricated storm shelter, animal safe, temperature regulated, and funded almost entirely by donations. "No more leaving anyone behind," said Pastor Lee as he handed Benjamin the first shovel. Someone brought folding chairs, someone else brought lemonade. And the funny thing was, it never felt like pity. It felt like gratitude. Like the town had remembered something it hadn't realized it lost. On the 3rd day, Benjamin found a bundle of envelopes tied with twine on the porch. Each had a child's name scrawled on it. Inside, hand-drawn portraits, folded dollar bills, and notes that read things like, "Thank you, Ash, for being brave," or "You're the coolest dog cat ever." Ash sat on the porch rail as if she knew the letters were hers. She didn't purr, didn't meow, just stared out at the street with quiet poise, like a soldier on watch. Inside, the once dim cabin was coming back to life. The walls still smelled faintly of smoke and lemon cleaner, but Benjamin had strung the children's drawings along the window frames like garlands. One even made its way to the old photograph of Lucille on the mantel, her smiling face now haloed by marker hearts and paw prints. Benjamin stood at the threshold that night, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, eyes brimming. "You wouldn't believe it, Lucille," he whispered into the breeze. "They're rebuilding us, piece by piece. Ash brushed gently against his calf. And somewhere just past the trees, the pack curled up beneath a patch of starlight, no longer just dogs. Family. They started arriving in twos and threes. By the end of the week, the post office called Benjamin directly. "You might want to bring a tote bag," the clerk said. Benjamin showed up with a canvas sack Lucille had once used for groceries, still faintly embroidered with her initials, and left carrying over 30 letters. The handwriting came in all forms: blocky crayon scrawls, trembling cursive, military print as precise as formation drills. One envelope had no return address, just a red heart drawn in the corner. Another was postmarked from overseas, smudged with desert dust and foreign stamps. That night, Benjamin laid them out on the kitchen table, where soup bowls used to go, where Lucille once folded napkins with care. He read them aloud to Ash, who sat on the windowsill, silhouetted by dusk, her tail curling in rhythm with his voice. "My name is Captain Darius Mullins. I lost my canine partner in Fallujah. I hadn't believed in second chances until I saw Ash. Thank you for reminding me." Benjamin paused, eyes glassy. "Dear Mr. Benjamin," another read, this one printed in orange marker, "my cat bites everyone, but I still think she's a hero inside. I showed her Ash's video. She didn't bite me for a whole hour." Ash blinked slowly. He chuckled through his nose. Others were heavier. "I have PTSD. I don't leave the house much. But when I saw Ash with your dog, something in me softened. I don't know why I'm crying. Maybe because someone out there gets it, that healing can come in unexpected shapes." Some came from universities. One formal letter, complete with crest and watermark, requested permission to study Ash's behavior, her pack adaptation, her mimicry of canine alertness. The author called her a potentially groundbreaking case in interspecies emotional convergence. Benjamin read it twice, then folded it neatly and set it aside. He looked at Ash. She was now asleep in Hazel's blanket. One paw flopped over her face, her soft breath barely disturbing the folds. "She's not a case," he said softly. "She's family." That night he drafted only one reply. It wasn't to a professor or a news outlet or even a donor. It was to a boy named Eli, age 9, from Nebraska. Eli had written in pencil on lined school paper, "Dear Benjamin, when my dad went to heaven, I didn't want to feel anything anymore. Then I saw Ash save you. Now I want to feel again." Benjamin wrote back by hand, sealing it with care. "Dear Eli, sometimes the world sends you something small and quiet to remind you it still loves you. For me, that was Ash. I think she'd like to meet you someday. With hope, Benjamin." He placed it on the porch railing the next morning, and when the mail truck came, he made sure it got on. The wind carried the scent of pine and ash and rebuilding. Ash stirred from the blanket as the screen door creaked open. She didn't meow. She didn't bark. She just looked at him, as if to say, "We keep going." The invitation came printed on soft blue cardstock, with a note handwritten at the bottom. "Even a single moment of comfort can mean the world. Dr. Janice Rowe, Director, Coldwater Children's Resilience Center." Benjamin stared at the envelope for a long time, then looked at Ash, who was curled between Bruno's front paws, and whispered, "What do you think, little miracle? Ready to share some of that quiet magic?" They arrived on a Thursday morning, the sky still pale with early sun. Hazel wore her therapy harness, the one Lucille used to adjust with loving fingers. Bruno had a red bandana tied loosely at the neck. And Ash? Ash was tucked in Benjamin's jacket, only her ears peeking out, like sentinels. The Children's Center was a modest brick building just past the edge of town. A garden of forget-me-nots lined the walkway. Inside, the air smelled of soap, paper, and something gently sweet, maybe chamomile. Dr. Rowe met them at the door, her smile warm but cautious. "We don't expect anything, just presence. Sometimes that's enough." In the softly lit common room, children sat in scattered bean bags, eyes flicking toward the door, then away again. Some clutched blankets. One boy in the corner traced spirals into the carpet with a single finger. Ash wriggled in Benjamin's jacket and leapt lightly to the floor. She moved like mist, unhurried, unafraid. Bruno stayed near, but watched. Ash paused in front of the boy, drawing spirals. She blinked. Sat. The boy didn't look up. Ash tilted her head, then curled up beside him, her body just grazing his side. At first, nothing, then a tremor, a slow glance. His hand stopped moving. He placed it tentative on her back. Ash didn't move. He whispered, not quite to her, not quite to anyone. "Soft, like my sister's blanket." A stillness swept the room. One of the therapists covered her mouth. Hazel lowered her head and let out a breath through her nose, as if even she understood the gravity of that whisper. Benjamin turned away, not to hide emotion, but to give it space to live. The boy stayed with Ash for nearly an hour, his hand never leaving her fur. He didn't speak again, but he didn't need to. Something cracked open. A door, long sealed, now ajar. Before leaving, the boy stood and surprised everyone by reaching for Benjamin's hand. "Can she come back?" he asked. Benjamin crouched to eye level. "If she wants to," he smiled, "but I have a feeling she already said yes." Ash meowed softly, then leaned into the boy's leg. No tricks, no therapy script, just instinct. And sometimes that was enough. The visits became ritual. Once a month, like clockwork, the little convoy arrived. Benjamin's old truck, Bruno in the passenger seat like a co-pilot, Hazel and Ash nestled in the back. Scout, ever the sentinel, sat perched with his head out the window, tongue lolling, ears tuned to a world only dogs can hear. When they pulled into the lot behind the Coldwater Children's Resilience Center, the children waiting at the window no longer just watched. They waved. And Ash? She stood on the dash as the truck slowed, tail flicking once, then leapt down with a quiet purpose, as if she already knew which hearts needed her most that day. Inside the center, the energy was different now, warmer, brighter. Hazel, usually the more reserved of the dogs, had become a quiet star. Children took turns weaving plastic beads into her fur, whispering stories as their little fingers worked. "This one's for my mom," one girl said. "And this one is for me when I'm brave." Hazel never moved, just breathed softly, her eyes blinking slow acceptance. When they were done, she rose like a queen with her crown of color, a living tapestry of hope stitched by small, careful hands. Scout had taken to working with a girl named Maddie, who wouldn't speak, only signed. One afternoon, as rain tapped the windows, Scout began mimicking her motions. Maddie would sign "stay," and Scout sat, ears perked, tail still. "Good job," she'd sign again, and this time he barked once, softly. The therapist watched with tears brimming. "It's like he knows what she needs," she said. Benjamin simply nodded. They all do. And Ash had claimed a corner of the nap room. She didn't roam anymore. She waited. And when the children drifted off, tiny bodies under knit blankets, their breath still uneven from old wounds, Ash would slink beside one, curl into their rib cage like she was a piece of them they'd lost and were only just remembering. One child woke from a nightmare trembling, tears caught in his lashes. Ash didn't run. She climbed his chest and placed her paw on his heart. He breathed in, out, and the shaking stilled. By the fourth visit, the staff had unofficially renamed the trio the Quiet Guardians. And Ash, she was the one they called when nothing else worked. "I thought I'd adopted a stray," Benjamin told one of the volunteers, eyes crinkling. "Turns out I was just late to meeting a healer." Sometimes during those long afternoons, Benjamin would sit in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his hat pulled low, listening to laughter he hadn't heard in that building for months. Sometimes it sounded like Lucille's voice, soft, proud, steady. Maybe purpose wasn't something you chased. Maybe sometimes it found you, covered in ash, curled up beside grief, and stubborn enough to stay. The storm had passed, this one at least. Outside the cabin, Coldwater Creek glistened beneath the last rays of a winter sun. The rebuilt fence stood strong against the wind, and the rebuilt man inside stood even stronger. Benjamin moved slowly these days, not from age, but from reflection. His steps were quieter, his shoulders softer. Loss had carved its lines into his face, but healing had painted light into the cracks. It was evening. Hazel and Scout lay curled by the fireplace, their breaths deep and even. Bruno, ever the watchdog, dozed by the door, one ear still attuned to a world only he understood. And on the couch, Benjamin sat with Ash splayed across his chest legs draped over his flannel shirt, head resting near the steady rhythm of his heart. He held the remote in one hand but didn't press play. Not yet. Instead, he reached for the old record player in the corner. It creaked slightly as it turned, groaning in that way all well-loved things do. He selected the vinyl carefully, the one with Lucille's favorite song, the one she played every Sunday morning while dancing barefoot in the kitchen, apron smudged with flour, hair pulled back, laughing like she had forever in her pocket. The needle dropped, a soft crackle. Then melody. The tune, mellow, nostalgic, impossibly gentle, floated through the room like a prayer spoken with no one in particular in mind, and everyone at once. Benjamin leaned back. Ash stirred slightly but didn't move. Her ears twitched, then flattened. She exhaled. His hand found the spot between her ears and rested there, the way Lucille used to do with every animal they'd ever rescued, as if to say, "You're safe. You're home. You're wanted." The record played on. Benjamin didn't sing, but his lips moved with the words, silent and certain. His chest rose beneath Ash's small rhythmic breaths. "You kept your promise, Lucille," he said finally, voice low, raw with memory. Ash blinked once slow, knowing. He looked down at her. "You brought them to me. When I couldn't find the way forward, you sent them." The cat stretched a paw, touched his chin, then curled again back into sleep, back into trust. Outside, the wind picked up, but the cabin stayed warm. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, a barn owl called across the pines. And Benjamin smiled. Not the ghost of a smile, not the half-smile of a man who's trying, but a real one, the kind that comes when pain doesn't leave, but finally learns to live in the same room as love. The snow had returned, light as ash. It drifted across the front porch in lazy swirls, dusting the boots lined in a row and the rake leaning quietly against the rail. Inside, the cabin was warm with wood smoke and soft breath, the hush that only animals and old wood could hold between them. Benjamin stood in the hallway, sifting through the hall closet. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just chasing motion the way you do when your heart is too full and still needs somewhere to go. He found her coat folded neatly in the back Lucille's heavy winter parka, the one with the torn hem and coffee stain on the left sleeve. He hadn't touched it in over a year. Something about it always felt too alive, too hers. But today, something tugged at him. He pulled it free and held it close, catching the faintest trace of her lavender cedar, something sunlit and gone. A pang struck him in the ribs, that old ache that never said goodbye. As he went to hang it on the hook by the door, something crinkled, a sound like memory trying to breathe. He reached into the inner pocket, fingers brushing against paper, folded small, yellowed at the edges, a letter, no envelope, just a piece of lined note paper, her looping handwriting dancing across it like it had waited just long enough for him to be ready. He unfolded it slowly, the way you lift the last petal of a dried flower. Ben, if you ever feel the fire's gone out, follow the paw prints. One of them might lead you home. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I believe the ones with fur will always find us first. They don't need directions, just heartbeats. I love you, always will. L. He stood frozen, the silence in the room swelling with the echo of her voice, so vivid it nearly split the air. Scout padded over first, sitting at his feet, then Bruno, leaning his weight into Benjamin's hip. Hazel lingered near the stairs, watching him with those soft, seeing eyes. And Ash curled on the windowsill, tail flicking once, then again. Benjamin blinked hard. The letter trembled in his hands. He knelt slowly, pressing the paper to his chest as if trying to memorize the feel of it, the warmth hidden between the lines. I never followed the map, he whispered. But you left a trail, didn't you? Ash meowed quietly, just once, and outside the snow kept falling. But in Benjamin's chest something had started to thaw. The night was silver, the kind of silver that came not from frost or fog, but from a moon so full it felt like an eye watching, remembering. It lit the trees in hushed outlines and traced shadows through the tall grass like forgotten paths waiting to be found again. Ash sat still at the edge of the woods, paws tucked beneath her, tail curled tightly around her side. The earth was cool beneath her, damp with late snowmelt, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes, those pale orbs that had once stared blankly into fire, were now wide open, fixed on something beyond the reach of human understanding. Behind her, the dogs flanked in silent formation. Scout, seated upright and still, ears pivoting at the faintest forest creak. Bruno, head low between his paws, a low rumble resting just behind his breath. Hazel, patient as ever, blinked slowly at the stars, her heartbeat calm, steady. They had come here on their own. Benjamin had opened the back door after dinner to let them stretch their legs. They hadn't come bounding back like usual. Instead, they had melted into the dark without a sound, and when Benjamin stepped out to find them, this was what he saw: a cat and 3 dogs, still as statues under a cold moon, staring into the woods as if listening to something just beneath the silence. He didn't call them. Something about the way they sat made him stop at the steps, barefoot and quiet. The wind stirred gently. Pine needles whispered to one another above, and somewhere deep in the trees an owl gave a single low hoot. Then silence again. Benjamin wrapped his arms around himself, not from cold, but from reverence. Ash didn't look back, but her ears turned slightly, acknowledging his presence. It was enough. He stood there for a long time, watching them guard whatever it was they sensed, a shift in the air, a stirring of old memories. Perhaps Lucille's note had done more than speak to him. Perhaps the animals, too, had heard her voice between the lines. They remained like that for nearly an hour. A strange peace settled over the cabin. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was the quiet kind. The kind that finds you after fire, after flood, after the worst has passed, but your heart is still learning to beat in calm again. And then Ash stood up. She looked toward the trees one last time, then turned. Bruno followed without command. Scout rose with the grace of a sentinel ending his watch. Hazel brought up the rear, her fur catching the light like a veil. They walked back toward the porch, single file. Ash paused at the steps, looked up at Benjamin. Her gaze was unreadable, but it didn't need words. He opened the door for them without saying a thing. The dream came gently, as if it had been waiting patiently behind the door of sleep. In it, the cabin was just as it once had been, before fire licked its edges, before the floodwaters clawed at its base, before grief made every floorboard groan with memory. The porch glowed beneath a honeyed morning light. That kind of golden hush right after sunrise when everything feels forgiven. Lucille was there. She stood barefoot, in the robe he hadn't been able to throw away, her hair gathered loosely at the nape. Her hands, small and strong, cradled a chipped mug, the blue one she used to fill with dandelion tea and press into his palms on cold days. She looked younger, or maybe just lighter. The weight was gone from her shoulders. No sickness, no shadow, just her. Whole. Benjamin stood a few steps away, barefoot too. He looked down and realized the porch boards were warm beneath his feet. The air scented faintly of cedar and something sweet, maybe cinnamon. Lucille smiled. That smile. The kind that always felt like it saw straight through him, but never judged what it found. "You're not alone anymore," she said. Her voice wasn't grand or ghostly. It was soft, familiar. Like it belonged not in dreams, but in morning routines and quiet dinners, and the pause just before saying, "I forgive you." He took a step toward her. And suddenly he felt the presence around him, not people, not faces, but something living and warm. He turned and saw shadows, a curled cat by the hearth, a lumbering dog napping under the table, another perched beside the window, tail thumping once. Peaceful, guarding, home. Lucille looked past him then, eyes softening even more. "You kept your promise," she whispered, not to him exactly, but to the air, to the life that had bloomed in her absence. "And they've kept you." He wanted to speak, wanted to say everything that had broken and rebuilt since she left, but no words came, just breath, just heart. Lucille stepped closer, her fingers brushing his arm. "I have to go," she said. A flash of panic sparked in him. "Not again," he wanted to say. "Please, not again." But before he could reach for her, she pressed her palm to his chest, over his heart. Warm, steady. "You know the way now." And with that, the light behind her grew brighter, until the porch blurred, the forest behind it glowing with morning, with memory, with something he could no longer name. Then, the creak of real floorboards, the smell of coffee, a sliver of sunrise slicing across the wall. Benjamin woke. Tears had soaked the corners of his eyes, but there was no tightness in his throat, no panic, no ache that demanded to be answered, just breath. He lay still for a moment. Ash was curled on his pillow, her tiny paw resting against his shoulder. Hazel's tail thumped once against the bed frame. Bruno let out a soft snore from his corner. Scout stretched, his paw brushing the worn edge of Lucille's robe hanging quietly on the doorknob. Benjamin smiled, one hand coming up to press against his chest, where her palm had rested in the dream. Peace. It was small. It was quiet. But it was real. The first nail went in on a Tuesday morning, while fog still curled low over the hills like an old memory refusing to lift. Benjamin stood beside the fence line, coffee in hand, watching as strangers turned friends gathered in flannel and work boots, their breath fogging in the crisp air. No formal speeches, no ribbon cutting, just hammers, timber, and quiet resolve. Ash sat on his shoulder, tail curled delicately around his collarbone. She blinked slowly at the bustle, unmoved but not unimpressed. Bruno paced along the perimeter like a foreman. Hazel carried sticks to anyone who would take them, convinced she was helping. Scout stood statue still on the rise, surveying the forest like he always had. Watchful, patient, ancient in ways no one could explain. The cabin had stood for over 40 years before the storm took her ribs. Now she would rise again, stronger. Not in defiance of nature, but in partnership with it. Cedar beams, steel reinforcements, a stone foundation 2 feet higher than before. The architect had quietly left out the words flood-proof, because nothing in Coldwater ever truly was. But what they built now was no longer just a home. It was a promise. Teenagers painted the new porch rails. A retired roofer from Jasper Creek climbed ladders with more grace than Benjamin had at 30. Edith brought cornbread wrapped in cloth and left a jar of her plum preserves on the windowsill without saying a word. By the end of the second week, the bones of the house were standing again, tall, firm, familiar. But it wasn't until they built the porch that something shifted. It had been Lucille's favorite spot. She would sip tea there at sunset, humming tunelessly while Bruno dozed at her feet. Benjamin had feared it would feel like a ghost now. But the team, without being asked, had carved something new into its soul. Wide planks, warm to the touch. Railings at just the right height for Ash to perch. 3 shallow steps, so the dogs could leap up without strain, and a low, cushioned bench tucked into the corner, designed for no other reason than comfort. At dusk, after the workers had packed up and silence reclaimed the valley, Benjamin sat there, Ash curled beside him. Bruno stretched long and lazy on the top step. Hazel laid her head on his boot. Scout lay facing the tree line, alert as ever. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. From the porch you could see almost all of Coldwater, the ripple of trees down the ridge, the soft gleam of creek water catching the moon, the outline of the barn they never used anymore but couldn't bear to tear down. And from Coldwater, if you looked just right, you could see the porch. That was the point. The animals weren't just sheltered now. They were stationed, visible, watchful, at peace. A little girl rode past with her mother, perched on a bicycle too big for her. She slowed, pointed at the porch, and whispered something that made her mom smile. Benjamin didn't hear the words, but he saw their echo warm, brief, healing. A porch was just wood and nails, but this porch was a sanctuary. It was a watchtower, a memory keeper. It was home. And this time, it was built to last. The Coldwater Town Fair hadn't changed much in 50 years. The same hay bales lined the walkways. The same faded red and white booths sold kettle corn and handmade soaps. And the same carousel music drifted above the murmurs of children and cows and clumsy laughter. But this year, something new walked through the gate. Benjamin wore his cleanest flannel and a patched denim jacket Lucille had once embroidered with pine needles and stars. He walked slow, not out of stiffness, but reverence. Beside him padded Hazel, her coat brushed and bright, tail gently swaying like a metronome of calm. Scout followed just behind, head low, eyes scanning not for threat, but for the uncertain kids who always found their way to him. Bruno moved at the rear like a boulder with paws, content, unstoppable. And perched squarely on Benjamin's shoulder, claws tucked gently into his collar, was Ash. People turned to look, but not out of suspicion anymore. Out of something softer, something close to wonder. The announcer had to say Ash's name twice at the ribbon tent before Benjamin realized what was happening. "For distinguished instincts in a high-stress environment," the man declared into a crackling microphone, "and for bravery during the Coldwater floods, we present this year's honorary K9 award to Ash the cat." Ash tilted her head, unblinking. Someone laughed. Then the crowd clapped genuine, full-throated, and loud. A little boy in a wheelchair rolled forward and offered Ash a ribbon nearly as big as her body. She sniffed it once, then gently pawed at the corner as if testing its meaning. Bruno huffed behind them, tail wagging like he knew pride wasn't just for people. They wandered through the fair after that, not trying to impress anyone, just being. Hazel stationed herself in the children's petting zoo, surrounded by sticky fingers and wide eyes. One toddler tried to braid her fur using a corndog stick. She didn't flinch. Scout spent his time near the pie contest, sitting beside an elderly man with a tremor who hadn't spoken to anyone all afternoon. 10 minutes later, the man was telling Scout a story about his time as a Navy cook and laughing at his own forgotten jokes. Ash disappeared for a while, then reappeared beneath the funnel cake booth, startling a teenager into shrieking laughter. She returned to Bruno's side and curled beneath his chin, a perfect comma beneath a sentence of quiet strength. He didn't move, just opened one eye and let her sleep. Benjamin sat on a bench and watched them all. For a moment he felt Lucille's hand slide into his again, not in grief this time, but presence. Real, steady, like the air had softened just enough for memory to breathe. A woman passed by and said, "That your crew?" Benjamin looked at the 4 animals, each rescued, each strange, each exactly where they belonged. He nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They're my family." The woman smiled and moved on. He didn't say it to be poetic. He said it because it was true. There was nothing ordinary about their little circle. A half-wild cat with tactical instincts. A German shepherd who slept through sirens but woke at a child's whimper. A golden mutt who thought every visitor was a blessing. A stoic mix who had seen war in a man's eyes and stayed anyway. And Benjamin, who once thought he'd live the rest of his days in a cabin of silence and ghosts. They weren't bound by blood or species or rules, but they were bound. And under the wide sky of Coldwater, with kettle corn in the wind and the carousel playing something old and lovely, they didn't need to be understood. They only needed to be together. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No return address. Just thick parchment tucked into an envelope that smelled faintly of cedar and lemon oil. Benjamin almost tossed it with the flyers, but something about the wax seal pressed with what looked like a pine cone made him pause. He opened it slowly, standing barefoot on the porch, ash weaving figure eights around his ankles. Inside was a handwritten note, inked in a careful, looping hand. Dear Mr. Whitaker, you don't know us, but we know Ash. We know Bruno, Hazel, Scout. We know the silence you've lived through and the noise they helped you walk out of. My wife and I watched your story unfold from 3 states away. It came to us during a week when we'd nearly given up on people. But your animals, your quiet steadiness, reminded us what grace looks like when it has paws and mud on its belly. We used to own land at the edge of Redwood Hollow, a parcel meant for our retirement, before her diagnosis rewrote our plans. We no longer need it. You, however, seem to. Enclosed is the deed. Do with it what feels right. We only ask one thing. Let it be a place where second chances sleep soundly. With quiet thanks. Micah and Aaron Caldwell. Benjamin reread the letter 3 times, then sat down hard in the porch rocker, the wood creaking beneath him like an exhale. By sundown, he'd driven out with the animals to find the place. It wasn't much, just 7 acres of pine and fern and old stone walls that time had almost forgotten. But at the clearing's edge stood a small wooden cabin, weathered but upright with birdsong in its eaves. And nailed into the split-rail fence near the entrance, freshly sanded and painted with care, was a sign. Lucille's watch. Bruno sniffed it first, tail wagging like a metronome of knowing. Hazel leaned against Benjamin's knee. Scout dropped a pine cone at the porch step like a housewarming gift. Ash perched silently on the fence post, ears forward as if reading the trees. Benjamin swallowed hard. He hadn't cried in weeks, not since the dream. Not since Lucille told him, in whatever place dreams come from, "You're not alone anymore." But now, staring at those words, her name carved in wood, watching over a place meant for those with nowhere left to go, his breath caught. And this time the tears didn't sting. They flowed slow, clean, like spring water clearing winter rot from the roots. He walked the perimeter before dark, each animal padding beside him in loose formation. No command, no leash, just presence. He imagined what it could be, a safe place after storms, a cabin for foster animals and wayward creatures, a porch where silence could rest and still be heard. That night he built a small fire inside the old hearth. He didn't say much, just sat cross-legged with Ash curled in his lap, the dogs flanking him like sentries in sleep. Outside, the wind rustled through pine boughs, and somewhere a barn owl called once, then again, softer. Benjamin closed his eyes and whispered into the dark, "You'd like this, Lucille." And for the first time in years, he felt her answer, not in words but in warmth. The old porch smelled of cedar shavings and fresh-baked apple bread. Benjamin had spent the morning wiping down the wicker chairs, brushing Hazel's fur until it gleamed like brushed wheat, and gently rearranging Scout's growing collection of chewed-up pine cones into a tidy row beside the steps. Ash, as always, needed no grooming. Her coat was windswept perfection, her silence more eloquent than most stories. By 2 o'clock, the first of the children began to arrive. Some walked with their parents, others biked in pairs, baseball caps tilted back and crayons clutched like scepters. The youngest, a boy named Milo with nervous hands, brought a well-loved blanket he never let go of. He placed it beside Ash and whispered, "This is for her. I think she dreams too." Benjamin watched from the doorway, notebook in hand, its pages filled with sketches and scribbled phrases. Ash leapt without fear. Bruno barked only when it mattered. Hazel taught the wind how to listen. The title was written in soft pencil at the top of page 1, Ash and the Three Shepherds. It wasn't a grand story. There were no dragons, no kingdoms, no magic spells, just a girl with storm-colored eyes and 3 dogs who loved her enough to guard the night. But somehow that was enough. "All right, little rascals," Benjamin called gently, easing into his creaky porch rocker. "Today's chapter is called The Blanket by the Fire." The children settled around his feet, some crisscrossed on woven mats, others curled against their parents' legs. Ash lay at his side like a sentinel. Hazel rested her chin on a child's shoe. Bruno snored softly beneath the porch swing. Benjamin cleared his throat and began to read, his voice gravelly but warm wrapped around the words like bark around a tree. Once upon a time, a girl with fur instead of words curled beside a lonely boy on a cold night, and though neither spoke, both listened. Somewhere during the 3rd page, Milo leaned his head against Hazel's flank. A girl named Ella traced Ash's paw with her finger, whispering, "She looks like the one in my dreams." Benjamin paused, let the hush settle. For a moment, even the pine trees listened. When he turned the page, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Edith, the woman who once doubted them all, sitting quietly on the edge of the porch with a thermos in her hands and her cane beside her knee. She didn't say a word, just smiled when Ash gently rested her chin on Edith's foot. By the end of the story, the sun had dipped low, slanting light through the slats and washing the porch in gold. The children clapped soft and sincere, the way you do when clapping isn't just polite, but grateful. And then they asked, all at once, "Can we come back next Sunday?" Benjamin looked at Ash, at Hazel, Scout, Bruno. Then he looked to the horizon, where the trees framed the sky like cathedral windows, and he thought of Lucille. He smiled, just barely. "Yes," he said, "every Sunday, as long as the porch still stands and the dogs still listen." As the children filed out, waving their drawings and tugging at their parents' sleeves, one little girl with auburn braids tugged Benjamin's sleeve instead. "Is it real?" she asked, holding up the notebook. "Did Ash really save a whole house?" Benjamin didn't answer with words. He simply bent down, placed her small hand gently on Ash's fur, and said, "Sometimes the quietest heroes are the ones who never needed to say they were." That night, after the sun fell asleep behind the ridge, Benjamin stayed on the porch a little longer. The dogs circled close, Ash in his lap. He didn't write anything new. He just flipped to the first page and traced the title again with his finger, Ash and the Three Shepherds. And for the first time, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt full of children's laughter, paws on wood, and a promise carried forward on soft winds. It was near dusk when the new arrival came, shivering in a woven laundry basket, mewing like wind slipping under a door. The kitten, no bigger than Benjamin's boot, had been left by the gate with a note scribbled in shaky pencil. "She's gentle, just scared." Benjamin stood on the porch, the note still in his hand, while Ash approached the basket without a sound. The porch light above them flickered once, then cast a soft golden hue across the wooden planks. It was then he saw it again, that glowing mark on Ash's chest, the small white crescent no wider than a thumbprint. Lucille used to call it her guiding moon, said it looked like something left behind by a star that couldn't stay, but wanted to bless her anyway. Ash nudged the basket gently. The kitten hissed, fur bristling like pine needles in a storm. But Ash didn't flinch. She simply sat down, nose close, ears soft, body still. Waiting, listening. Hazel lay nearby, watching with quiet curiosity. Scout peeked out from the shadows, ever the observant sibling. But it was Bruno Broad, aging, gruff in his movements, who took a place at the edge of the porch steps like a retired sergeant on watch. He didn't interfere, just kept his eyes on the scene like it was sacred. Minutes passed. Then, with the gentleness of falling snow, the kitten stepped out. One paw, then another, trembling. Ash didn't move. The kitten sniffed her nose. Then, without hesitation, it crawled beneath Ash's front leg and curled into the soft space between her chest and shoulder, right beneath that faint white crescent. Benjamin exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a week. He looked down at Bruno. The old shepherd blinked slowly, like he'd seen this before and always knew how it would end. "You still remember what it's like, huh?" Benjamin said to him softly. "What it feels like to be afraid and still stay." Ash looked up, eyes glinting in the porch light. Not with pride, not with command, just with something steady. Something human beings had always struggled to name, but that dogs carried like birthright. Patience without condition. The kitten let out a sleepy sigh. It was the smallest sound, but it filled the porch like a prayer. That night, Benjamin didn't write. Instead, he brought out an extra dish of milk, set it gently by the step, and sat cross-legged on the porch beside them all. The stars began their slow march above the cabin. The wind hummed in the trees, and that soft white crescent glowed beneath the porch light like a promise fulfilled. The next morning, the kitten followed Ash through the yard, paws clumsy but determined, like a recruit trailing a general. Hazel let her bat at her tail. Scout barked once when she tried to chew his ear, but only half-heartedly. Bruno simply sighed and laid his chin back on the step. Benjamin sipped his coffee and watched it all unfold. "You're not just raising animals," he murmured aloud, the mug warming his palms. "You're raising kindness." And Ash, still leading the kitten in wide, careful circles through the garden, paused, looked over her shoulder, and wagged her tail once. A slow, silent yes. The porch creaked under the weight of time. Autumn had rolled in early that year, brushing cold water with crisp air and the scent of dry leaves. Benjamin sat in his weathered rocking chair, a quilt draped over his knees, the one Lucille had sewn, patch by patch, through winters past. His beard had gone full white now, like frost on old pine. His hands trembled a little as he sipped from the blue mug that had long lost its handle, but never its place. Before him, stretched out like 4 sentinels of memory, were the companions who had grown old with him. Bruno, the old soul, lay like a stone lion at the porch's edge, his muzzle grayed but his gaze still alert, half in this world, half in some dream he refused to leave behind. Hazel snoozed nearby, her ears twitching at every gust of wind, still the gentlest guardian of children and bees. Scout sat upright, stiff in his hips but proud in his silence, scanning the woods like he had since the day he first arrived. And Ash curled at Benjamin's feet, tail flicking softly, her white crescent still shining faintly in the dusk. They didn't bark any more, didn't chase the wind or dart through the brush like they used to, but they were still watching, always watching. Benjamin set his mug down on the railing and rested his hand on Ash's back. The fur was thinner now, softer somehow, like the edge of a prayer. She stirred at his touch, blinked up at him with those eyes that had seen more than he ever could explain. "You remember that night?" he said, voice barely above a whisper. "The storm, the fire, the silence after." Ash didn't move, but her tail gave the smallest thump against the porch boards, just once. Benjamin smiled, a slow, quiet thing like a memory unspooling. "I thought we were done. Thought everything Lucille and I built was gone." Ash raised her head, ears tipped forward. "But you," he continued, "you made it more than a promise." The wind rustled through the trees like a low lullaby. In the distance, a fox barked once. Somewhere below the hill, a child laughed, probably chasing leaves. Ash meowed, softly, not loud, not dramatic, just enough. Benjamin's eyes welled, not with sadness, but with something gentler. Acceptance, gratitude, the kind of peace that doesn't come from answers, but from presence. Her meow sounded again just once more, low and even, her version of "I know." He chuckled, wiping at the corner of his eye. "Of course you do." He looked out over the land, past the rebuilt cabin, past the weathered fence, out to where the trees bowed like elders, paying respect. Lucille's watch stood in the distance, steady, warm lights flickering through its windows even now. The animals shifted closer around him, forming a silent circle, as if to say, "We're still here, still home." And as the sun dipped below the ridge, casting the porch in gold and gray, Benjamin closed his eyes for a long, peaceful breath. His final watch would not be alone. In a world too often rushed and fractured, sometimes healing arrives not with grand gestures, but on quiet pause and soft meows. Through the story of Benjamin, Ash, and the three shepherds, we are reminded of something profound, that love knows no species, and family is not always bound by blood, but by loyalty, shared silence, and the courage to keep going. German shepherds, so often seen as fierce protectors, here reveal their gentler truth. Steadfast companions with hearts attuned to pain, joy, and purpose. Ash, the once lost kitten with a crescent moon on her chest, became more than a rescue. She became a guide, a keeper of promises, a bridge between grief and hope. This tale isn't just about animals. It's about listening, choosing kindness, and understanding that even in our most broken moments, there are souls furred or not waiting to sit beside us and remind us we are not alone. May this story inspire you to look closer at the animals around you, to adopt, to protect, to love fully. Because sometimes the ones who save us don't speak our language, yet they say everything we need to hear.